John to make some contribution.
Thanks very much, Megan, and thanks very much to the Levellers Day for co-hosting both the Lilburne 400 conference that we had back in March at the Bishopsgate and tonight's event. Is great to be working with you, and thanks for all the work that you've done for this event. Of course, it's important to welcome you to David Cameron's constituency to talk about the Levellers. There obviously should be more of it. I congratulate the CWU for holding on to a red base in Oxfordshire. I'm sure at some point you'll be able to sweep down on the major villages and take them back. But until that point, let's just talk about John Lilburne. I'm just going to give a brief kind of overview of the kind of arc of John Lilburne's career as a revolutionary. I think it's important at a time when we're being encouraged to think more fully and to embrace more completely British values, to think about the English revolutionaries of the 17th century and what they stood for and what they fought for. Some of it is massively unfinished business. Famously at the Putney debates, the debate was between the extension of democratic rights, and the objection to that was that it would take away all property, that it would lead to anarchy. I would say that the Levellers raised that question, and it still hasn't been answered. Lilburne himself, just to give you this overview so that what Anne and Ted say can be kind of located in his career, was the best known revolutionary on the kind of radical end of the spectrum of the English Revolution. He came south from where his family lived in Durham, or around Durham. Came south in 1629 and was an apprentice in the city of London, and the apprentices were in many ways one of his first audiences. He managed by some incredible feat, even when he'd been imprisoned for importing radical religious material from secret presses in Holland. He was seized and jailed. He became famous because as part of his punishment, he was tied to the back of a cart and whipped from the Fleet Prison, which is where Fleet Street is, all the way to Palace Yard in Westminster. When he was stuck in the stocks, he was still throwing the pamphlets from his coat pockets to the crowd and making speeches, and eventually was gagged to stop him speaking from the stocks. And it was the trials that surrounded that case and his insistence on his right to be properly tried, to be treated by the law, not to be tried in a prerogative court, in a state court where you could be forced. In fact, the only testimony would be the testimony that the defendant themselves gave under interrogation. This may sound familiar to you as well. And it was from his performance at that time that he gained the popular nickname Freeborn John, or Honest John Lilburne, because he claimed the rights of freeborn Englishmen and not to be tried in a prerogative court and not to be forced to give testimony against himself. He became a leader of the street protests at the beginning, involving the apprentices that he'd worked with. He actually managed, astoundingly, again with the assistance of, and he was assisted primarily, as I'm sure Anne will explain, by Elizabeth Lilburne, who was a considerable revolutionary figure in his own right. But early on, Catherine Hadley, we don't know a huge amount about her, but a more elderly woman who managed to get out, cared for him while he was in prison, and managed to get out a leaflet that was distributed amongst the apprentices in Moorfields, and he was at least accused of, or accredited with, whichever way you want to look at it, causing a riot among the apprentices. In 1639, even before the revolution had got going, Lilburne had managed to smuggle out a leaflet which was accorded the accolade of having caused a disturbance against Archbishop Laud. He was one of the early leaders of street demonstrations in Westminster that occasioned the sort of initial crises of the revolution that led to the execution of Charles I, Archbishop Laud. He was an early advocate of gathered churches, that is, churches that were outside the national church. You have to think, if you're thinking about the church in the 17th century, and you want to kind of imagine its kind of social weight or position in the society, you have to think of it not as the church today, but as an institution which combined the functions of aspects of the civil service, aspects of the education system, aspects of the legal system. If you didn't attend church on a Sunday, it was compulsory. It was a legal requirement that you attended church. If you didn't, and this is why Catherine Chidley was punished for non-attendance at church, you could be fined, ultimately imprisoned for doing that. So to advocate, as both Catherine Chidley and John Lilburne did, and they arrived in London at about the same time, they and Catherine Chidley's son Samuel Chidley, who later became the treasurer of the Leveller movement, were very early associates in the 1630s, years before the revolution, some years before the revolution got going. They were one kind of nexus, one kind of connecting point, which brought together religious radicalism, popular mobilisation, and illegal printing. And I guess if you wanted to say what were the conditions, what was the environment from which the Leveller movement began to emerge, it was those things. Breaking from the national church, being a religious radical, being involved in street protest, and having a secret press is at your disposal. It was famously said of Lilburne that the minute he said something, it would appear in print and be distributed around the place. He fought in the Parliamentary Army, was captured at the Battle of Brentford, taken to Oxford, imprisoned by the king and put on trial by the king in Oxford, held in Oxford Castle, which is the Oxford prison. The later prison is now a Malmaison hotel. It's I've stayed in it. I've stayed not by accident, I explain. It's actually a rather creepy experience now because the rooms are still cells, and for people in our walk of life, that's I have to say a disturbing and an unusual experience to voluntarily walk into a cell, even if it's as well decorated as those with an Malmaison are. Anyway, Lilburne was freed under dramatic circumstances that I'm sure Anne's going to talk about, so I won't elaborate on that. And he was involved in the arguments within the New Model Army, and after he left the New Model Army, still in contact with the troops about how the direction of the revolution would develop. And as happens in the course of revolutions, the sort of broad front that begins a revolution, I mean, it's almost a requirement of a revolution that the regime against which it's aimed has become socially isolated, that there's a very broad section of the society, even up to and including its natural supporters, that can no longer stomach the society. But it is again, I think, an almost universal characteristic of revolutions that as they progress, that broad front breaks down. And what some people would have found to be an acceptable deal with the king is to many people, at least by this stage, not acceptable any longer, if it had ever been acceptable. And at each of those turning points, and there were several of them in the course of the First Civil War, and then through the Second Civil War and up to the execution of the king, Lilburne stands at the most radical point of that. And what he brought to it in its final stages was a degree of popular organisation which was both unique at the time and probably what we would recognise as the first attempt at a recognisably modern political movement. There's a huge debate about whether it was a party or whether it was a movement. I think it's easier to think of it as a movement. It certainly had a relatively coherent leadership group. It certainly had a following, and it was certainly connected to those people by the pioneering. They weren't the only people using print, but they were the only people who had a popular organisation that used print for the purposes of popular mobilisation consistently and over a period of some years and years and months at the critical points of the revolution. They were consistent users of pamphlets, of petitions, of broadsheets, ultimately of short-lived newspapers, two short-lived newspapers, the Moderate, still inconceivable thought connected with these people in modern usage, and another paper directed mainly at the army, more short-lived, but actually even more radical in its content, called the Army Scout, or Mercurius Militaris, as they were all called Mercuries, as the paper, or many of them were. And so Lilburne, was, in my view, critical at the final phase of the revolution, when it boiled itself down to a decisive question about whether or not there would be a personal treaty with the king in 1648, whether he would be as one of the regiments petitioning, said whether he would, Ireton's regiment, Henry Ireton's regiment, Cromwell's son-in-law, when they petitioned, they said they were against the re-enthroning of the king, of the return of the king on a settlement that would maintain some, or perhaps even a great deal, of his previous power. And at the point where that becomes decisive, Lilburne and the Leveller organisation, although always a minority, even within the parliamentary camp, throw their weight, I think importantly, onto that side of the debate. And when the revolution reaches that settlement, when the king is executed, still after that, they find themselves in opposition to that settlement as not being, in their view, sufficiently radical, sufficiently democratic. They accuse Cromwell of having seized power in a military coup and of not having made a democratic enough republic, a republic based on popular sovereignty. So I think I've probably been going on too long, but those are some of the milestones of John Lilburne's career as a revolutionary, and I'm sure that Ted will add much more detail.